It's Matt Kirchner on the Tech Ed Podcast, the number one podcast in all of STEM and technical education. Welcome back. We're going to have an awesome episode today talking all about the future of technology. As our audience knows, I spend my fair share of time traveling around the United States and beyond, going to conferences, speaking at conferences, sharing all the great things that are happening in and around STEM and technical education. And so it was that I found myself at the Alliance for Innovation and Transformation in Higher Education, their conference in Phoenix, Arizona, early August of 2024. And I met today's guest, and you are just absolutely going to love what this individual has to say. I listened to his keynote, and I was just absolutely enamored with the message. We're going to share it today with the audience of the Tech Ed Podcast. Our guest is Toshi Hoo. Toshi is the director of the Emerging Media Lab at the Institute for the Future. And Toshi, first of all, welcome. It's great to see you again.
Thanks, Matt. It's great to see you again.
So tell me about the work you're doing. The Institute for the Future, I mean, that's a pretty big name for an organization. And of course, you've got the title of director of the Emerging Media Lab. But let's just start out kind of 30,000 feet, Institute for the Future, what it is that you do and why you exist.
Sure. Well, Institute for the Future is a nonprofit, independent futures research, design, and education organization. We're actually the world's longest running futures organization. We were founded way back in 1968.
Wow.
By some of the original computer and social scientists who were working on a little project back then called the ARPANET. We now call it the Internet.
Mm-hmm.
When it was first started out, it was just a government project looking at how you could make a distributed communication system. The vision for it was, this is just going to be used by military and academics to have computers talk to each other. But our founders started saying, well, wait a minute, what if this kind of real-time information system, what if this scaled out? I mean, that was the whole point of it, is that could be so distributed that everybody in the world could use it to have, real-time share of information, real-time communication. That might change the world, right? That might create a different future than we're imagining right now. And of course, that's basically what did happen. And our founders really have spent the next several decades really developing a set of methodologies around strategic foresight, as it's officially called, or more informally, futures thinking. And the Institute, we work now with large companies all around the world, government agencies, large foundations, NGOs, associations like the one we met through AFIT. We don't actually believe that anybody can predict the future, but we do think it's really critical to develop new practices, new methodologies for thinking and discussing possible futures, because we believe that actually the way the future is created is by people thinking about it and talking about it and making pathways towards the futures ideally the preferable futures they'd like to see. And the Institute has a number of different labs looking at all sorts of different types of futures, everything from future of food, future of governance. We have a future of learning and education. The lab that I lead at Institute for the Future is called the Emerging Media Lab, as you said. And the ML, as we call it, is really looking at the future of what I like to say, the future of human communication, collaboration, and connection, all through the lens of emerging media technology, as well as emerging media mythology, meaning not just what are the tools, but more importantly, what are the new stories we can tell that we couldn't tell before? What are the new conversations we can have that we couldn't have before? Also, very importantly, who's going to be involved in those conversations and that storytelling? So we take a very broad definition of media to be any sort of tool or platform that helps humans communicate, collaborate, and connect.
Awesome. So you invented the internet. Is that what you're telling me? Toshi Hoo invented the internet?
Well, actually, one of our founders, Paul Bannon, invented a little thing called packet switching, which back in 1968 was the idea of wrapping data with a little wrapper protocol that could be handled anywhere in the world. Coincidentally, at the same time, same year that the shipping container was invented.
Wow.
Before that, materials were shipped around the world in kind of random freighters. And the shipping container is exactly the same idea as a data packet. Like, let's wrap it into a standardized packet, and now it can seamlessly move around the world. And arguably those two inventions in 1968, the data packet and the shipping container, kind of led to the globalized world of where we can move around things and information.
What a transformative time. You think about a year like 1968. I didn't realize, by the way, that the shipping container had been invented all the way back in that period of time. Of course, if I'm not mistaken, that was the same year that both Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King lost their lives in assassinations. And so a hugely transformative year, not
year.
just for the United States and the globe. I'll tell you, there's one other incredibly transformative thing that happened in 1968 that doesn't get talked about as much as it should be. And that, of course, is the birth of Matt Kirchner and then eventually the Tech Ed podcast.
World changing.
Right, exactly. So it's just an incredibly transformative year. We'll give the audience a moment just to do the math on how old I am now that I disclosed what year I was born. But what a transformative time. And so you've been thinking about this for a long time. At least the organization has. How long have you been with the organization, Toshi?
So I joined Institute for the Future in 2016. So
Okay.
I just celebrated my 8th year.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's been a wonderful, weird, wonderful, amazing, unusual journey.
Yeah. What kind of a background leads to a role like that as director of the Emerging Media Lab?
Well, I've been interested in media and technology actually from a very young age. I got exposed to computers back in the early 70s when I was a little kid by my uncle, who was the early computer developer and programmer. Also got exposed by the same uncle to filmmaking, Super 8 filmmaking when I was a little kid. Went on to just kind of get involved in filmmaking, and animation. Ended up teaching a lot of that as a young child. And then eventually, when I graduated high school way back in the early 90s, I got into, 5 different film schools. And I visited them all, and not a single one was teaching how to use computers to make movies. They were literally cutting film and taping it together, which is cool for sure. But I knew even at that age, I knew that wasn't the future. The next stage of my career was about 20 years, actually 25 years as a media technology producer. I ended up going and teaching myself digital editing because you could at that time. I basically was able to get, the first version of Final Cut Pro at that time where, I basically had a full multi-million-dollar production studio in my backpack now.
Yeah, right.
And learned editing, ended up getting involved in media exhibits and storytelling, kind of immersive and interactive. So got more and more into that whole world. And then the late 90s started working for about 10 years with famed futurist Ray Kurzweil on a number of different media technology projects. And that's where kind of my media technology background and then the world of futures came together.
I mean, I followed Kurzweil for decades, actually, certainly not as closely as you did, but we're going to talk about the Singularity in just a little bit. So
I hear it's near.
Exactly. I heard that too. We'll get into that. And
actually nearer, according to me.
Without question. We'll get into that in just a minute and talk about what the Singularity is and why it's important and why I've been fascinated with it and you as well. You'll have to go back and listen. We had Eric Newman, who's the executive producer for Griselda, Narcos.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember his other big, Painkiller with Matthew Broderick. And absolutely, just absolutely fascinating. He was on, I'm going to say maybe 3 months ago or so. We'll link that up in the show notes for the audience, talking about the way that, he kind of came of age, I think right about the same time you did in the world of media and film and how technology has absolutely transformed that. In fact, he made the prediction that AI would write the next great American screenplay at some point in our lives, which I thought was a really fascinating thing for somebody with his pedigree to be talking about. So amazing how these technologies are changing everything. You've had a front row seat to that all the way back to, changes in film technology, working alongside somebody like Ray Kurzweil, who's, an absolute international thought leader on the technologies and the change that we're talking about today. What are some of the technologies you have your eyes on now? I mean, what should our audience be thinking about as we look to the next several years in terms of things that'll really transform the way we live, work, and play?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, I started the Emerging Media Lab back in 2016. And prior to that, my career has been looking at kind of different emerging technologies, whether that be immersive dome shows. I mean, back in the day when just even having interactive media was a new thing, I got very heavily involved in that. But in 2016, the big story and kind of the emerging technology that people were interested in was virtual reality and augmented reality. So for the first 6 years of the lab, it was primarily focused on researching and prototyping and forecasting around what the impact of XR, virtual reality and augmented reality, would be on a variety of different sectors. Having been, involved in exhibit design, I'm really keen on focusing on immersive experiences. And, just so happens, virtual reality is an immersive experience, and it's really difficult for people to understand anything about it unless they try it.
Right.
And so a lot of what we created at Institute for the Future over those first 6 years was an experience lab. And we curated a wide range of all the kind of emerging XR hardware, from AR mixed glasses to virtual reality systems, as well as interesting content. And then we also built a lot of our own prototypes for VR and AR to try to explore what's possible then. But yeah, the last 2 years, I mean, ever since the kind of release of ChatGPT, something happened, right? There was this new chatbot, and we'd seen chatbots going as far back to 1950s. AI was not a new idea, and there's been many attempts, and there's been things like Siri and Alexa. But there was a new chatbot that came out, ChatGPT, and it came out as a public research demo online, and no promotion. It wasn't a product, no advertising. And within a month, it had 1 million users, right?
It's crazy.
And the reason is because it wasn't like any other chatbot anybody had experienced before. It had a level of cohesiveness and general knowledge that by many accounts kind of passed the proverbial Turing test. We don't talk about the Turing test anymore because we kind of essentially passed it back then.
What was the Turing test, just so people know?
So the Turing test, Alan Turing was one of the early innovators in computer science. He built the famous Enigma computer, analog computer for World War II to break the codes of the Germans. But he imagined basically all of the computing systems that we have today. And one of his thought experiments, he imagined this idea of a Turing test, or a test where you would have a text interaction with a computer, and you would have a text interaction with the human, and you would not be able to tell the difference.
Got it.
And so for many years, and particularly, when I was working with Ray Kurzweil, he talked a lot about, when are we going to pass the Turing test? Because it was always very obvious. And there is an organization that was running the Turing test for many years, and different AI developers were developing systems to try to pass it, essentially. But really, what we've seen now, and I think we've seen studies of this, but we also can just anecdotally, I think experientially, people are going and using ChatGPT, and that's what the amazing thing about it. It produces extremely human-like text.
Sure.
So that was a turning point for our lab, and we realized we see AI as another medium, right? It's going to be a medium for human communication, collaboration, connection. And we've just been focusing on trying to digest kind of the big developments that have come out with this, try to sort the noise from the hype. And a lot of my role at Institute for the Future is as interpreter. So helping people understand what a technology is and its fundamentals. We've been talking about AI for a long time. Suddenly it's here. Generative AI is different than other forms of AI. And it's different in some really important, non-intuitive ways. So a lot of my work is just trying to help people kind of wrap their mind around what this is, especially as it changes so quickly, right?
Give me an example of a non-intuitive way that AI is different.
Well, probably one of the most important is that generative AI is different from what I would call classification AI. So we've all been using classification AI in our daily lives, right? That's what's suggesting movies to us on Netflix, curating our social media feeds and things like that. And that's what we would think of as pattern recognition. And those algorithms are very powerful and they've been somewhat useful, but they haven't been able to kind of have cohesive conversations and generate new ideas. Okay. Generative AI is much more pattern generation. So it looks at lots of other previous data, and what it does is it generates new patterns based on that data. And the surprising kind of discovery with especially ChatGPT from OpenAI was that they were able to not just put forth cohesive information, but things that sound kind of intelligent. Now, the non-intuitive part of it is that typically most technology and most software is what we call deterministic, meaning it's consistent, right? You put in certain inputs and you get the same outputs. Generative AI is non-deterministic, meaning you can put in the same inputs and get different outputs each time. Imagine a calculator where you hit 2 + 2 equals and you got a different answer each time. And that's what gives it its creative ability, but it's also what makes it kind of unpredictable, at times unreliable.
Right. Hallucinations, yeah.
Exactly. Hallucinations is one of the biggest issues. And so one of the things I like to point out is that people they hear AI and they think precision answers.
Right.
And the challenge of generative AI is that it can give correct answers, but it's actually not designed to generate answers. What generative AI is designed to do is generate output that looks like an answer. And that's confusing because lots of answers that look like answers are correct answers.
Right.
The problem is not only do some answers it outputs are not correct answers, correct, factually, ethically sometimes, historically correct, but the problem is they look exactly like a correct answer.
Sure.
And that's where we start to get into trouble.
If you look out 10 years, what will we be doing with AI and generative AI that we're not doing now? That would be like crazy.
Well, we're at the very, 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 very beginning, right? Where, in fact, in many ways, most of us are still using the research demo that came out. It wasn't even a real product, right? ChatGPT. We're just having a little chat experience in a window.
Right.
And most of those are kind of linear, somewhat ephemeral conversations. And most of them are text-based. So what we're starting to see already is, first of all, these large language models are not just about English, Spanish, French, or Chinese. That language is being applied to any way that humans communicate symbolically. So that can be, now we're starting to see image generators, right? We're starting to see video generators, and not just generators, right? These models are being trained on looking at images or video or songs or X-rays or scientific data or molecular structures. So any form of data is now becoming kind of the training input into this. So these systems are not only able to do those individually, but they can do multimodal in combination. So you can have like a text-based or voice-based conversation about some medical data that it's also ingested and then output a 3D animation. So that's one of the major changes that we're going to see over time. And as we kind of build out the more of the synthetic media side of generative AI, not just the text, but the ability to generate not only videos and images, but real-time experiences, and that's when we start to approach, and this is where we start to intersect with something like XR, virtual and augmented reality,
right?
Which is what is going to be the interface for something like that, right?
Sure.
And so now we're able to essentially do things that are essentially equivalent to the holodeck, right? That's a forecast that we had from many years ago that's starting to become more and more feasible. One of the ways we kind of reframe XR and AI in the long term is to think about this as social, spatial, generative computing, meaning that, in the same way the internet turned computing into a social experience, right? We just assume anything we're doing with a computer is going to have some connective part to it, right? It's going to be connected to the world in real time. So it becomes more conversational. These tools, are going to become more and more of that. And then it's going to go beyond just data, information, and media. Like right now, the chatbots we're experiencing are giving maybe answers and advice. Like it might kind of give you an idea or something. The other big transformational aspect of this is when these systems start to have agency. And you might hear this term agent or agentic. And what they're talking about is the ability to do things in the world, not just talk about them. So that could be buy a plane ticket. That could be approve a loan. It could be, operate a robot to clean your kitchen. This is another big kind of transformative aspect that we're starting to see the beginnings of as well. Now, I will say there's a lot of visions and a lot of hype around this idea of creating agents, because the other idea is that you could not just create an agent to go and do one task, but that you could give it kind of a high level goal. Like, can you make sure my house is clean and also decorated for the holidays? And not have to say like, put up the lights and, put my clothes away and all these things, but that it could break down complex series of tasks, decide what to do. And now it has agency and autonomy. This vision is what is kind of driving a lot of this idea of how transformative AI could be in our lives, where it's not just a chatbot on a screen, but it's creating whole different kinds of media experiences, as you mentioned earlier, going to transform how we create, the media that we produce and how we're going to create that. Moving into more immersive kind of holodeck simulation experiences. I mean, that's another aspect that we talk about quite a bit is that.
So that's the second time you used that term holodeck. So I think I know what you mean, but help our audience understand what that means.
Sure. Sorry. That's a reference to a Star Trek thing from the Next Generation in the 90s. And the idea is that you could step into basically kind of a room and that create holograms or like a virtual reality immersive experience. Right. But that it's not just a simulation of what's going on, but it will be interactive. So you could say, please bring me to 17th century China.
Okay.
You can recreate that and have characters in that space. Or you could say, let's go inside of a COVID molecule And let's explore that at scale. So if we combine kind of the idea of XR, which is the ability to kind of go anywhere at any time, any scale, as many times as you want with anybody, that's kind of the simulation side.
Right.
When we look at the AI side of things, a term you might hear a lot is model, right?
Okay.
With large language models.
Sure.
One of the ways we think about the kind of long-term future here is that we're building these capacities to model systems, right? With language models, we're modeling kind of how language works, how intelligence works, how human communication works. But we're starting to model even more and more complex systems like how our bodies work, or how AlphaFold, which is a famous project, looked at trying to anticipate how proteins fold. How do we model how physical molecules interact? And now they're working on how drugs would interact with those. And this is this new capacity that, as we talk about kind of transformative, not just how we use these tools, but how humans actually even think. I call it thinking through models, right? Traditionally, we think of like models like a climate model, right? Scientists take, really geeky scientists have the ability to go take all this different kind of data, put it into a supercomputer that no one really has access to, and now kind of can theoretically anticipate what the weather is going to be tomorrow, or if we're going to have climate issues, in the next 5 years. This capacity is about to become democratized to everybody. The ability to kind of model, meaning describe a system based on data. So that could be a past system. And then it kind of works in hand. The ability to model is the ability to take information, data, observations, and make a representation of that system. And that system could be a chemical system. It could be the 3D world that we live in. Holodeck kind of refers to the idea of like that you would interact with a simulation like in VR of 3D characters and 3D environments and 3D objects. But now extrapolate that to much wider forms of data, like let's say traffic data in a city or just urban development over time. You could model a city, and then run simulations of either what has already been observed or what could happen in the future. And of course, that's what one of the things we're interested in at the Institute is the ability to pre-simulate scenarios from a model.
Awesome. Does all this mean that we're rapidly approaching the singularity? What do you think?
Well, it depends on how you define the singularity. That can mean
what's your definition? Yeah.
So the original term, Ray Kurzweil, who I worked with for a bit, he coined that term in more popular vernacular. Before that, it was really an astrophysics term that refers to an event horizon beyond which is very difficult for humans to understand because the dynamics of that paradigm are so different than everything else we've ever experienced. And the classic example of that is a black hole, right? Because matter, gravity, this thing pulls light in ways that are just not the way we think about how gravity works or what is mass, right?
Right.
When Ray kind of introduced it, this was kind of a similar idea. And he, I think one of his biggest contributions to kind of helping people understand not just how to think about the future, but how transformative technology was going to be, was this idea of exponential change. That's a little bit more of a common idea now. And even in like businesses, we expect kind of like, 100x,
right. Yeah.
A change, transformation from technology. But we have to remember back even just a couple decades ago, change was extremely incremental and technology adoption was even really relatively slow. It wasn't until kind of the advent of the internet that, software could be shared immediately that really changed. But Ray really kind of put forth this idea that technology, and this is based on kind of Moore's law, the idea that, the founder of Intel said, Gordon Moore, we double our computing power every 18 months. And it's something he observed and was able to kind of map out and was a truism for a long time, although there's some discussion if that we're kind of reaching our physical limits on chips, although there might be ways.
Well, they keep saying that, but it's interesting. And we always tied it to as well the exponential economy and the idea that products can double in price performance every 12 to 18 months, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, was a kind of a Kurzweil. I don't know if that originated with him, but that whole idea of the exponential economy was something that kind of flowed out of the Gordon Moore idea that we can double our ability to process information, or the speed at which we can process information every 12 to 18 months, or I think in Moore's case, maybe every 2 years. I mean, that whole concept just fascinates me. I've been fascinated by the whole concept of the exponential economy and how quickly things are moving. And maybe we're coming to the end of that from a microprocessing standpoint. I don't know, but it doesn't feel like we're slowing down at all in terms of innovation.
And to your point, Matt, this idea of exponential growth has been kind of translated into other schools of thought around economics, around kind of business and things like that. It is, of course, it's quite appealing to the business world. The idea of like exponential growth of profits or, capability is very attractive. So that's really kind of what Ray was talking about in his New York Times bestselling book, The Singularity is Near, that was released back in the 2000s. I actually went on to co-direct a documentary film based on that book with him a couple of years later.
So how closely did you work with him? I mean, you brought him up and I knew that you guys have been connected. I followed his work for decades. And I think his original website was like kurzweilai.com or something. He actually had the foresight to put the letters AI right in the URL. And that was 20 years ago, right?
Yeah. So my history with Ray goes way back to the late 1970s back in Boston, where I grew up, and Ray's from the Boston area as well. He was, kind of from MIT. And my dad worked for his company back in the day. So a young child, one of Ray's kind of biggest, earliest inventions was the reading machine for the blind. He focused on pattern recognition at MIT, and he combined optical character recognition system. This was in the 1970s.
Yeah.
Optical character recognition system with a speech synthesis system, and then some software for pattern recognition to tie it all together, and created the world's first machine that could read a book out loud to a blind person.
Amazing.
And I, as a child, my dad had one of these sales records. I remember it was one of these like printed records you could send out in a mailer that was square. It was kind of floppy, and 45, I put it on there. I listened to the reading machine for the blind. I went to his office a couple times and got to play with it and have it read books and stuff. So that was my first, and I was actually, you asked me how I kind of got into the futures world. That's actually, I wouldn't say I was working with Ray, but I was influenced by Ray from a young age. Sure. The idea that you could combine technologies, and that by doing that, by making technology and media more accessible, you could radically change the world. It wasn't till around the late 90s, and I was living in the Boston area, and actually my friend was the web developer who made kurzweilai.net.
I said .com. It was .net.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
At the time, I think he has .com. He's probably got both. Ray went to SIGGRAPH. It's the annual computer graphics conference. This was in the kind of late 90s. He saw an early version of a digital Kermit.
Okay.
A digital puppet. This is really early, before making digital characters was way before Toy Story and way before Pixar.
But sure.
The Henson crew had a digital puppet, and Ray saw this, and as the mythology goes, he went home that night, had a lucid dream in which his female virtual alter ego, Ramona, spoke to him and said, "Ray, I want you to use virtual reality technology to bring me to life." Huh. And so Ray went to the office that day and told some folks in the office about this. My friend, who knew I was doing interactive media technologies, kind of reached out and said, "Ray has this idea." Our other friend, Noah Rafford, who went on to become the lead futurist for the Dubai government, by the way, was a 3D expert. So Noah and I were brought in to build one of the world's first real-time character animation systems for Ray to perform live on the TED stage in the year 2001 as a female virtual alter ego himself. So he's on stage with this motion capture suit, and then we translated that in real time to a digital, essentially avatar, a puppet. And again, no one had heard the word avatar, had seen anything.
Right.
It seems
23 years ago,
today.
It's crazy.
We believe it was the world's first real-time character animation performance ever done. So that was my first kind of big project with him. And then I went on to do a bunch of other smaller ones, but it wasn't until around 2005 to 2008 that I started working with him on the feature film, the documentary.
Got it. So is he a pretty down-to-earth guy? You think about, he's just so incredibly smart and so living in the future. Tell us about that.
Well, I wouldn't call Ray down to earth. He is, he's a visionary. I mean, he's a nice guy, and he's friendly, and he's playful, and he's humorous, and his family's great. And his daughter, I just saw Ray and his daughter at their book signing for his new book, The Singularity is Near.
Yeah, cool.
But no, Ray is not a normal person.
Right.
He's operating, he's thinking kind of in a different sphere than most folks. He's incredibly smart and has been thinking about kind of like these possibilities for literally the last several decades. So he isn't necessarily kind of like thinking so much about the present. He's thinking about what the possibilities are. I would kind of characterize him as a bit on the utopian side. I think he believes that more technology will always be better for humanity. I'm not sure I believe that. I think he's a technology theorist. I think anybody who's a technology practitioner knows that technology is always kind of broken.
Right.
And number two, and technology, the more complex you get, the less predictable it gets. So
Absolutely.
we're living at this time, right, where we're in one way feeling like it feels like we're living in this technological future where we have virtual reality and artificial intelligence, and we have all this technological power and potential, but it also feels incredibly kind of delicate and fragile.
For sure.
Right?
Yep, no question. Yeah, it's interesting. I was listening to Andrew Ng, who's, as you know, a crazy entrepreneur a crazy successful entrepreneur in the world of AI. He's an adjunct professor at Stanford. I watch a lot of his stuff on YouTube, and he was talking about the singularity, and the interviewer asked him the question of, are we close? And he said, I don't know if we'll have it in the next 10 years. And, for our audience benefit, when I think about it, it's like we get to the point where computers can think and mimic humans in ways that are indiscernible, which is kind of it's not exactly the perfect definition, but it's the way I think about it. Andrew's answer was, I don't know if we'll be there in 10 years, but I kind of hope we do. I kind of hope I get to see it in my lifetime, was kind of what he said. And I'm not sure that everybody looks at it exactly the same way. I think it'd be cool, but I also think it's a little scary. Is that kind of your thought?
I mean, the very definition of the singularity is a paradigm that we can't conceive of because it's going to be so different.
Right.
So of course that could be scary, right? And it could be wonderful too.
Yeah, by definition, right?
And Ray has thought a lot about how it could be wonderful, but I think it's also easy to think about how it may not be. At very least, it might be different and uncomfortable and hard to adapt to, right? I'm glad you defined the singularity. I mean, there's kind of two main ideas attached to the singularity. Number one is what you described, that this idea of like essentially human level or superhuman level intelligence. So the idea that, well, once we even kind of reach human level intelligence, the fact that it continues to improve and self-improve potentially,
right?
That we reach this kind of exponential curve, right? And that we kind of have takeoff or liftoff, as some people would call it, like that it just goes so fast beyond what we can think of. The other kind of way that people think about the singularity often is this idea that's sometimes referred to as transhumanism, which is that we're merging with our technology. So, and that can be very literal, like Elon Musk's Neuralink, where we're like putting electrodes in our brain and having an interface. Or it could just be, I think it'd be argued that we're already somewhat transhuman with our phones, right? Like
no
we
question.
use this all day. It becomes kind of an extension of ourselves and our body, and our psychology and our social networks at this point.
Yeah, when I get that report every Sunday morning that shows my screen time, there's no question that that's actually happening to me.
Exactly. And I think you asked about my history. TF, it's interesting. When I joined in 2016, I also look back to that as a time where there was a bit of a shift, I think, about the general public's perception of, is technology bringing us to some sort of utopian world, right? Until that point, I was like, oh, social media, it's so fun. We're all connected. And it was in those following years that we started really seeing examples, data, and really analysis saying like, maybe technology, maybe the internet is not great in all ways. It's spreading massive disinformation. It's causing overthrows of democracy in some places. And it's a mixed bag. And I think, that's really part of what we try to do in the Institute for the Future, is to really kind of expand our range of the types of futures. When we do forecasts, it's always important not just to consider a future, but a range of futures. And I think this is a little bit of where I diverge from Ray. Ray has a very kind of singular view of like, okay, this is where we're going, and that's exactly what's going to happen. And the reality, I think, is that the future is much more what I call multiversal, meaning not only are there multiple possibilities, but we're all going to experience that future from multiple perspectives, right?
Sure.
And those are all very different. So I think we need to have, I always really push for more of kind of a pluralistic view of like how we think about the future, and really try to dispel the myth of kind of the futurists in the ivory tower who's going to tell you what's going to happen, and more that we all need to develop our capability individually and as collectives, the ability to kind of have cohesive and valuable conversations about the most importantly, the futures that could happen, and what are the preferable futures we're actually trying to create.
Well, one of the things you referenced earlier was the idea that you're not necessarily trying to predict the future, that nobody can predict the future. I read a book probably 20 years ago and sat through a series of lectures on this idea of what they called scenario planning. And the whole idea was that the goal isn't to figure out exactly what's going to happen and get there before everybody else, or make sure you're prepared for that version of the future. It's to say, okay, these are the 4 or 5 things that are most likely to happen. And if I start to see the world going in one direction or another, and you could think about that as broadly as all of technology or as narrowly as maybe things that would affect an individual business, then I've got a plan for where to go. And it sounds like your philosophy is almost the same thing.
little bit. I would take it even further to say that, we do create forecasts at the Institute. That is kind of our bread and butter, forecasts and scenarios. So forecasts are descriptions of the future. We like to say they're plausible but provocative statements about the future that help us make better decisions today.
Right.
It's not enough just to say something of the future. It's got to be able to be something that we can facilitate and use today. And then scenarios are more stories about those futures. So how do we imagine what it would be like to inhabit those as an individual or operate within those future forecasts as an organization? It's through thinking through not just the forecast. You're never going to come to an IFTF event and just read a forecast and be like, okay, I know what's going to happen now.
Right.
The point of it, the actual kind of product that I like to say is not just even the things that could happen, but most importantly, as you run through your own scenarios around you as an individual or you as an organization, that you learn about your organization. You start to see yourself and your organization in ways you couldn't see before. And I even caution people from this term future proofing, because also that assumes like, okay, I know probably what's going to happen. I think if you assume that you know what's going to happen, you're going to miss what's actually happening.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
We are in a world that's increasingly volatile and unpredictable and chaotic. It's comforting to think, okay, I know what's going to happen or I'm future-proofed, and people love that. But the comfort is actually lulling us into not paying attention to what's happening. Now, in our practice, I kind of alluded earlier, when we run a forecast, we run what's called the 4 alternative scenario forecasts, which means you don't just run a forecast, you play that forecast out. So for example, if my forecast is in 5 years, we are going to have more virtual humans than real humans. And then you play that scenario out in 4 different kinds of archetypes. This is a framework created by Jim Dator, who is one of the grandfathers of strategic foresight at University of Hawaii. And those are growth scenario, collapse scenario, a constraint scenario, and a transform scenario. And it's through running those different kinds of scenarios on the assumptions that your forecast has that you start to understand the dynamics of what could happen. So if this happens, that might happen. And that's going to help you better be prepared and be what we call future ready, not future proof, but increase your future readiness so that you're able to kind of recontextualize your own model of who you are and the options you have in these new operational environments.
Which is, it's just fascinating to think about that. And to think, what were the 4, by the way? It was transformative, collapse, growth, and constraint. Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at the world, without a doubt. All the incredible work that you're doing at IFTF, I've got to believe you've got like one great success story of, we have this nonprofit, there's a reason that we exist that's obviously beyond just generating cash flow and generating, economic results. We're doing this great work. You have a story that might resonate in terms of where you really helped change a life or change a market space or do something that you felt really good about?
I could give you a bunch of different examples about kind of the work that we've done with big companies or government agencies. One of the challenges is when you're doing 10-year forecasts, you don't often, it takes a while to kind of hear back from people if those are, helpful or useful. But we do occasionally. Well,
that's the benefit too, is that if you're wrong, nobody remembers by the time 10 years goes by.
Exactly. I could talk about projects and I'm happy to, but to be honest, in my work, the times where I feel most successful with what I'm doing is after I give a keynote, for example, giving a talk about generative AI. And when I come to somebody and they tell me, thank you, you explained that to me in a way that I could finally understand it.
Awesome.
To me, the future is less going to be created by like one great entrepreneur that's going to be the one that changes the world, and more about the kind of collective understanding and literacies that we're building across all of our different layers of society and different types of folks.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm happy to talk about projects as well, but in terms of like feeling success.
That's a perfect example. I think it was in Malek's book, and I know you interviewed Ethan Malek at one point, where he talks about that being one of the great gifts, is the ability to, if it's not him, it's somebody else that I read recently, but it talks about the ability to take really complex concepts and boil them down into something that the average person or somebody who isn't a subject matter expert in that area can understand and comprehend and understand the impact. And I would say you definitely have that gift, having seen you speak myself. So that's a great example of how the work that you're doing is helping to change lives. I want to give you one more opportunity to talk about something that changed a life, and that's your own life. One of the questions we love to ask every one of our guests here on the Tech Ed podcast, Toshi, is to ask them to go back in time. You go back in time to that 15-year-old version of yourself. Your dad's working for Ray Kurzweil, which had to be just an incredible experience to grow up in a home like that. Before you had all the success in film, before you had all the success in media, and then the incredible technology stuff that you're doing these days. If you could go back and give that young man one piece of advice, Toshi, what would that be?
That's a great question. As a futurist, I'm often thinking about the future and not about the past. If I were to go back to my 15-year-old self, I would say, be your natural, curious self. It's going to take you places you could never imagine you'll go.
Absolutely.
And it did. I actually like to say that my main product that I produce for the world is wonder.
Yeah.
Meaning motivated curiosity. And I think that's the most transformative thing you can do. And it's not just kind of like a playful, fun feeling. It's more helping people imagine that maybe the world is even larger than they imagined.
No question it is.
And then it leads them to asking questions and growth. And I think that's really how the world is really transformed. So that's how I got to where I'm at. So if I were to say to my 15-year-old self, I'd say just keep being curious. Don't try to guess where you're going to go. Never imagined it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's so fascinating. And I've been on this kick about curiosity this year, and it's been influenced by guests we've had on the podcast. So I'll give you just 3 quick examples. Mike Bigley, who is the superintendent of a school district in Western Wisconsin, just created a whole emerging technologies lab for his students and all kinds of really cool applied AI experiences for those students. When he's looking for educators to be part of leading change like that, he said the number one personality trait he looks for is curiosity. Then we had Todd Wanek, who's the CEO of Ashley Furniture, good friend of ours, largest furniture manufacturer in the world, of course. And we asked Todd, when you look for people to lead your AI transformation, I said, what do you look for? And he said, curiosity was the first thing that he'd look for. And then we had Barbara Humpton, who's the CEO of Siemens, huge company, of course, Siemens USA, $20 billion in revenue, 45,000 employees, give or take. One of the things that Barbara Humpton said is, if you have curiosity and initiative, the world is yours. And which I thought was really, really interesting way of looking at the world, and the fact that here you are with all the cool experiences that you've had. Nobody knows what their career journey is going to look like. You've had an incredible career, no doubt more to come. But for you to say, hey, I would remind my 15-year-old self to be curious is just one more data point on this whole journey of curiosity that I've been on here over the course of 2024.
A lot of people come up to me right now and say, what should I tell my 10-year-old child now? I actually think the future belongs to the curious people. Right? We're in a period of time where so much is being disrupted. And that's scary, but it's also an incredible time for new things to happen. And it's the curious ones that are going to really create and explore those.
The future belongs to the curious people. I can't thank the curious Toshi Hoo enough for joining us here on the Tech Ed podcast. It's been a phenomenal conversation. We referenced some things I know our audience is going to want to check out. You will find those and all of our show notes at techedpodcast.com/who. That is techedpodcast.com/HOO. Need to remind our audience as well to check us out on social media. As you know, we are on LinkedIn, we're on Facebook, we are on Instagram, we are on X, we are everywhere you would ever want to look for your social media. So while you're there, reach out, say hello. We would love to hear from you. And we would love to see you again next week on the Tech Ed Podcast. Thanks so much for being with us.